I think most of our, our listeners, when they think about Lacan, they think about like this impenetrable kind of like corpus. And is this even in rapprochement with healing?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And this was just, it was so, I'm almost like reaching for like Winnicottian language, but like the structure that you're creating is this like extraordinary container. And I don't know, I found it really moving
No, thank
as a
you.
vision.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Certainly we could talk about both the theoretical and, I could share some practical challenges that come up too, because those are very real and we're still kind of learning as we go. But thanks. That's very nice of you. We're hoping to get it to a place where it can be published somewhere, because we've mostly just been kind of presenting different versions of it at conferences, and kind of testing it out a little bit. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. But it sounds like you've got like a critical mass of people also who are, really you're building a thing.
Yeah, it's a very exciting time, particularly here in New York, because there is a renewed interest in analysts working with psychosis, and there are many young candidates and younger analysts and therapists who really want to do this work. And we in some ways are victims of our own investment in this, because there has been this kind of momentum, and in some ways it feels like the momentum is stronger than what any of us as like smaller groups or institutions or clinics or groups can really hold. So I think there's a lot of thinking on our part about how do we sort of build networks and coalitions and spaces where we can kind of work as a community of people who are interested in this work, even if we're all working in somewhat different ways and in different settings. So it's really cool. It's a really great time to be working on this. And I think much of what's happening, I think, in New York City is against the backdrop of, more local politics and policy around treating serious mental illness. Certainly, most younger analysts are more politically progressive than, we see this in some of the most absurd, obnoxious ways in the past several years, in relationship to some of the bigger institutes and how they've handled anything from the George Floyd murder to Israel and Gaza. And so, I think there's just a political moment here too, where younger analysts are just far more politically engaged and are kind of thinking about how the political and the clinical meet and they don't meet. And I think this has especially been the case with working with psychosis. And many people are coming out of trainings, especially if you're trained as a social worker or a psychologist and then become an analyst or work analytically. They're working in institutions at some point in their training, which is both a very invaluable clinical experience, but it can really weigh on you. You can really feel and sense and experience the burnout that many well-intentioned people, caregivers, psychologists, nurses, psychiatrists, there's something kind of in the institutional frame and the policy behind it that is exhausting and can't meet the requirements of holding or containment that people with psychosis really need. And so I think that disillusionment has led to people really thinking about how do we reinvent working with psychosis in ways, given the limits that we're faced with.
What you're saying is really fascinating. And I also loved and admired the paper, where the situation that you're describing in New York and more generally, I think already puts into play in the terms you've used so many of the themes that are so important to your analysis, like this idea of spaces, both very literal as like geographical spaces, whether they be streets or physical buildings that are dedicated to treatment, like where, clinicians meet with patients, or even the idea you suggest of like respite spaces, right? Where people who are not in need of acute care can just spend time sort of processing and existing. And to also the theme of like connecting them and forming circuits, right? And allowing people to move through spaces and to be contained in spaces safely, and therefore to kind of reorient themselves or consolidate themselves or do some sort of work of what you call, subjectivization that is healing. This seems very much related to me also to what you're describing. And I think this may be one way to open our conversation into the more technical stuff that will be coming, with the ways in which people may use the term psychotic or invoke the idea of psychosis, and or encounter people who they deem to be that, or who may very well be in episodes of that, in the real world, and particularly in an urban environment, right, where people are rubbing shoulder to shoulder, and then suddenly you're on a subway and there's someone talking to someone who isn't there, or there's someone who seems to be an extremist but whose affect is extremely flat and is preoccupied with other things. And it's with that in mind that I kind of wanted to ask you, in a mode that wasn't about like, and as you say in the paper, right, that like is less about nosological naming, right? Or like even giving a structure that's will pass the test of more rigorous sort of breakdowns, i.e. is it chronic or acute or whatever. But just, could you help us sort of put into words a loose, heuristic way of describing what you mean by psychosis that might just sort of speak to those individual experiences?
I'll speak to this with many caveats that, I think are just honest reflections about what is just so difficult and the question itself, but also like very necessary to think about. So one of the challenges when you're thinking analytically about psychosis is that there's a long tradition of both European and American psychiatry that has led to a predominantly biological model of psychosis. I mean, this goes back to Kreplin's famous distinction between the affective psychoses and the non-affective psychoses, the organic psychoses, the toxic psychoses. You had this whole tradition of kind of trying to carve nature at its joints, in terms of defining not just psychosis, but also various manifestations of it, as you mentioned, both in terms of time, in terms of presentation of symptoms, and so forth. At the same time, these classic, at least what I'm increasingly finding, is that these classical psychiatric texts, you go back and you read Jasper's diagnostic book, you read Kreplin, you read Bloiler, and you find a certain wisdom in these older texts that I think have really been lost in the DSM-5. Certainly after the DSM-3, there's been an entire erasure of some appreciation of the subjectivity of the person experiencing psychosis and the relationship between subjectivity, their relationship to their world, their family, their social world, the historical period, how those elements relate to psychosis itself. And I think this has been increasingly erased in these kind of later, more contemporary nosologies. There's also a very rich tradition of phenomenological psychiatry that is not is not very popular among Lacanians, with some notable exceptions, but I think really does a nice job of giving language to even what you're mentioning, these encounters with others. It's on the street or in the clinic, or a student or a friend. It gives language to certain subjective experiences, both for the person with psychosis, but also for the person encountering such person. And that tradition as well is, largely been erased from how we psychiatrically think about psychosis. And there are exceptions to that too. So, I could speak to different languages around psychosis. And I think this is another challenge when you're thinking analytically about psychosis, is that, you're often in different spaces where you have to translate certain language
Yeah.
in describing what you're attempting to describe or what you're experiencing. For me, psychosis involves a radically different relationship to reality. And we could, of course, kind of parse that out a little bit in terms of what I mean by reality. And something that I have found, particularly helpful in the psychoanalytic literature, and it's not limited to the Freudian Lacanian tradition. You find this in the Lacanian tradition. You really, frankly, find it in any psychoanalytic tradition, is that there's something for people experiencing psychosis that they cannot relate to the symbolic world in a way that the world asks them to. Just about every psychoanalytic conception of psychosis, despite their differences, has as its core this question of the symbolic. So Hannah Siegel, famously developed this idea, or sort of extended it from Fenichel in some ways, but of the symbolic equation that is common in psychosis, meaning the symbol and the thing are equated. And what this means is, in everyday terms, or whether, again, you're encountering somebody on the street or in the consulting room, is that there's a certain relationship to language, to speech, to thinking that is often concrete. One discerns that a certain suppleness of thinking is absent. But this can also go overlooked quite easily. It oftentimes takes periods of anxiety, crisis, dread, significant shifts in one's life or their identity positions, where some of this becomes much more evident. But to me, that's one of the core analytic principles around psychosis, is a radically different relationship to the symbolic world and to reality.
What I admire so much about your work, and why I think we're so excited to have you on, is that I've always found the concept of psychosis so challenging, because it does work to describe these limited experiences, or these experiences that are distressing. It's used to describe encounters with texts, like the Schreber text that comes up in the Lacan, that I literally have a physical hard time reading. It actually there's too much there in some ways. Like I feel a kind of like contagion, or rather, I guess what I'm trying to say is it all those experiences of limits, of distress, of not having vocabularies, they all seem to put a pressure on individuals to like ignore the problem, to set aside the problem, to biologize the problem. I mean, we'd even probably say Freud doesn't have that problem, but what he makes he's like, this is not my problem. And that's how he deals with the problem, right? But what I find so admirable about your work, and why, again, we're so delighted to have you on, is that you are willing to both do that work in terms of actual encounters with people, but also to bring to bear different vocabularies and spaces, theoretical and, as you propose, concrete and clinical, to hold and contain and work with people in those conditions in a way that dignifies them as subjects, but that also really grounds them in grounds us in our awareness in a shared life world with them, with responsibilities.
To Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am really so happy to welcome Loren Dent, who I should say I've known for quite a long time through the Brooklyn Institute and through your teaching, Loren, of Lacan. But let me introduce you to the rest of our listeners. Loren Dent is a psychologist practicing in Brooklyn, New York. He is a co-director of the Green Clinic and a board member of the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis. He formerly led a treatment team for a first episode psychosis program in New York City. Loren is the senior editor of Division Review, a quarterly publication of Division 39 of the American Psychological Association. And he's also an instructor at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, where he teaches courses on psychoanalytic theory. He is also an analyst in formation at the Après-Coup Psychoanalytic Association. Loren, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for giving us some incredible reading. This is like one of the great joys of when we get to say like, hey, we've been kind of planning this episode loosely. What should we read? So I should say that Loren picked the readings today, and they were really generative. So before, we have so many questions for you, but I want to just tell our listeners that a lot of what we're going to be talking about centers on a piece that Loren co-authored with Matthew Oyer called The Risk of Space Toward a Treatment of Psychosis in the City. We also read the first few chapters of Lacan's seminar on the Psychoses, in an interview with Jean Oury, who I think is a figure that is less well known, but should be more well known. And the interview is called "The Hospital is Ill." So we have been immersed in thinking with Loren about psychosis in the Lacanian tradition, but also in some of what you're doing, which is, putting mid-century France into conversation's not the right word. There's a translation that is happening.
A circuit is being connected.
Something like that. Yeah. But, thinking about like, I said this before, but the way that you're thinking about, what are the implications of, New York City Mayor Eric Adams's ushering in of what I believe you're quoting somebody saying like a new age of the asylum, and a lot of what you're thinking about, which, can seem to be, I think really high flown and full of all of these, like, if you read Oury and you read Lacan, it can seem, like, okay, well, what's happening? There's foreclosure. There's the symbolic. There's some sort of lack of access to the symbol. But you're talking about things that are very, very real, and I think that we are going to be able to get into both parts of that today. But before we dig into the readings, can you tell us, Loren, a little bit about your path to psychoanalysis, both as a clinician, a teacher, I don't know, maybe also as an editor, however you want to take that?
Sure. It begins really in high school when I decided to join the debate team. So I grew up in Texas. I went to a, pretty run-of-the-mill public high school in Central Texas. And a good friend of mine, he and I were joining the debate team. And little did I know, and this comes to a surprise to many people, is that competitive debate, both in high school and college, certainly in the past 30 years, is profoundly tied to learning and working with and arguing with critical theory and philosophy. So this was a one of these momentous times in my life where my entire worldview, my desires, what I assumed would be my future, just became upended, but in the most kind of pleasurable and exciting ways. I was exposed, thankfully and luckily, to Foucault. When I was 17, Derrida. I very much gravitated to the French tradition, and it was one of those, like I said, kind of moments where something struck me, and it wasn't even clear what was so compelling about this. But it really, I've always said this, that it's kind of saved my life, in the sense that, not that I was going to die per se, but it's really hard to imagine, where my interests and my mind and my own personal history would have taken me had I not been exposed to this in high school. So I went to the University of Texas, and I studied, eventually, after many starts and stops in different majors. I eventually studied cultural anthropology, and it was there that I was also involved in activist circles at the university, and a small group of us began reading Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus.
Yeah.
By then I was somewhat familiar with Foucault's work on the history of madness, Derrida's critique of that, and I just, again, for reasons I still can't quite fully articulate, just gravitated to the extremes. I've always been drawn to theory that really challenges me, but also, you know, theory that speaks to people and events that are in the margins. So, in reading Anti-Oedipus, Foucault had this really fantastic introduction to Anti-Oedipus, and so I kind of made my way to psychoanalysis in reverse. I kind of started with the critiques that are laid out in that book, many of which I think are quite valid and strong. Some I think are, subject to critique and a bit of misreading, but it was extremely inspirational, and I realized I had to start reading Lacan and Freud for this to really make sense fully. And I can remember there being a period of my life in college where I would kind of manically run to the library and come back to the coffee shop where I worked with a stack of books on Lacan. And back then, the literature was so much more limited than it is today. I mean, it's really seen this kind of exponential growth in the past 20 years since I was in college. It was a very enthusiastic time for me. And studying cultural anthropology, I was taking a lot of interest in cross-cultural ethnographies of madness and psychosis, as well as some of the early debates around, between anthropologists and Freud and Freudians around the universality of the Oedipus complex and sort of the work on so-called primitive societies from psychoanalytic ethnographers. And so it began very, very theoretical in that sense. And, I had a period of time where I was kind of just spinning my wheels when I graduated and worked in political consulting for several years, and worked in public affairs a little bit. And then I finally decided just to, I wanted to practice somehow. I wanted to kind of do this work, and eventually got my act together and, applied to the new school. And that's where I completed my doctorate in psychology. I think, something that really struck me about Lacan early on, and I think this is why, I think apart from the sort of obtuseness of the writing, I think many people, particularly clinicians who are coming to Lacan, struggle with it, because there's a certain, I think, temperament one needs in reading Lacan, and also taking to heart a certain ethics that he encouraged in his writing. And I think because I was always a bit drawn to the non-normative, um, in ways that, led to some self-destructive behavior on my part back then. I think I just always appreciated his refusal to instill a certain normativity in clinical practice, as well as conceptualizing psychosis, neurosis, reversion, and I just, it gave me, a kind of way of starting to think about psychoanalysis and possibly becoming a clinician. It gave me a route that just resonated with something of my own temperament, something of my own history. So the stars aligned in a sense. I've sometimes wondered, had I started reading Heinz Hartmann,
Right.
would I have been that interested in psychoanalysis? I think I was lucky. I think it was just a kind of chance encounter. And I think, like I said, for many people who have been exposed to psychoanalysis in different ways, especially clinically, Lacan demands a lot of somebody in terms of rethinking certain fundamental concepts and ethics, and the psychoanalytic world, I still find this today, can be a very moralizing, normalizing profession.
Yeah.
And Lacan, among others, has always, given me a way to, to appreciate what's possible analytically when one can suspend that temptation to be moralizing. So, the work since I've been here in New York and been in, in graduate school and past that, I learned a lot from people who are coming from very different traditions. And, most of the learning, of course, is from experience. And, the first setting I was in was on an inpatient unit. None of these concepts from Lacan or anybody else, one can't just walk into a situation like that and make any sense of how the theoretical and the clinical meet or not. You have to kind of flail around a little bit for actually a long time and arguably forever. But it was really the experiential component of my training that both kind of allowed me to crystallize, I think, some of my theoretical thinking, but also to challenge a lot of it too, including from the Lacanian tradition. I have plenty of kind of misgivings about certain tendencies in that tradition. And so I think it's given me a way to kind of, situate myself in psychoanalysis in a way that hopefully is not too dogmatic and can appreciate the generative possibilities of other traditions and so forth.
Yeah.
Something that's beautiful about living in New York, among other places, is that you can work with anyone, in the sense of colleagues. And I think something that I've been thankful about, in terms of my own character, is that I've always been sort of willing to just, form groups with people, to start reading stuff together, to choose the people I want to supervise me. Again, a lot of, you know, there's a bit of a sort of more sublimated version of my tendency to not deal with authority particularly well. And so I've always been a bit independent in that way. And so it's really, thankfully allowed me to really kind of find a path for myself here in New York, and to also find some really wonderful colleagues who are really family now to me.
I want to ask you, I mean, we're getting like a sense of like, some of like your theoretical influences are taking shape here. Obviously, Jacques Lacan, primary among them. I wanted to ask if you could speak to what it means for you to work with Lacan and other figures that you find to be, important theoretical influences. What that means for like how it translates into your clinical practice.
Yeah,
And I mean, you may also want to speak to how, because you're a teacher, right? Also, so there's a lot of different ways to work with a psychoanalytic text.
absolutely.
And hell, I'll dive in here just as you describe your various influences and you're working particularly with Lacan, or rather the work Lacan did for you in your intellectual genesis, and describing that as both like an ethics and a practice of reading. I was thinking about how one thing I think reading Lacan does for me is it tests my capacity and patience to abide with confusion, to abide with overdetermination, a type of humility, and also occasionally it demands a type of decisiveness where I'm like, okay, this is not for me right now, I'm moving on or whatever. But in any event, I have to develop a capacity to abide with stuff that seems not just meaningful, but like super saturated in its overdetermination of meaning, yet
Yeah.
also kind of like operating on structures that I don't quite understand, and I have to be okay with that. I
Mhm.
shouldn't run away and be like, this is terrifyingly disordered, or this is an order that I must master. It produces something that actually does, when, as you put it, like, does kind of feel like an ethical or other orientation.
Mhm.
And so I'm just wondering about, with how that also translates into, like a, I don't want to hesitate to use the word vibes too much, but there are people I'm sure who'll be like, well, Lacanians, don't you mean you're smoking cigarettes at the Dumago and talking about your affairs? How could this possibly translate into anything one would do with a person in a psychotic break, right? But you've lived and written proof positive for that, so I'd love you to speak to that too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, the tension you're describing between this kind of wish for order and tolerating uh, ambiguity and not knowing and external obtuseness or enigma of the text, that is the clinical work too. I
Mm.
mean, that is the same dilemma of doing clinical work. Something I tell students when I teach Lacan is that there is that, for lack of a better word, kind of dialectic when you're reading Lacan. And sometimes people fall too far on one end of that, meaning, what I always underline to students is that there are concepts here, and it doesn't just mean anything,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? This is not a, sort of Derridian play of the signifier only, right? I mean, there are concepts, and they're grounded concepts in different intellectual traditions, of course. And I because of that, I will usually teach some very brief excerpts from Freud as I'm kind of introducing some of these key ideas,
Mhm.
because you have to kind of see that this is not being pulled out of a hat entirely, right? This is an elaboration of a certain trends in Freud's thinking and development, and not from just out of thin air. At the same time, I will stress that the experience of reading Lacan, and arguably of reading itself, is the experience of doing clinical work. That much of what Lacan teaches, you find almost getting played out and demonstrated in the experience of reading him, but also in the experience of clinical work. And one example of this is the idea that, if you rush to try to understand something, you're not listening. And that doesn't mean you'll never understand anything, right? This is not, but, there's a deferral. There's always a kind of deferral at work in what you comprehend that can, in certain moments, something will strike you that refigures everything you've already read or everything you've already heard. And this is the kind of temporal logic of reading, for me, and of studying and really grappling with concepts. But it's also the temporal logic of doing the clinical work too. I take very seriously, and this is Freud, not Lacan exactly. I take very seriously the ethical requirements of listening, right?
Mhm.
And so something as simple as that, or sound, it's not simple, but it sounds simple, of a certain kind of listening to the text of the patient. It demands a lot of us, clinically. It's a very demanding position to be in. It's a very sometimes dispossessing position to be in, and it's very difficult, if not impossible in some ways, right? And so something as simple as that, or seemingly simple as that, for me is a bit of a kind of guide in clinical work. I'm not, in my mind, one shouldn't be sitting with patients listening for the name of the father, or listening for the fundamental phantasm, or listening for the objet a. Something's going wrong. I would argue, in one's own positioning themselves analytically, if you're listening for theory, right? Theory gives us a way of transmitting something of the experience of analysis. It gives a way of transmitting something in supervision, but clinically speaking, it gets suspended, right? It has to be suspended. And this has ramifications in my mind to thinking about diagnosis, or even your first question around how to define psychosis, is that, you know, there are cases where you don't even land on a sense of, am I speaking to a neurotic or a psychotic until well into the treatment, if not after the end of the treatment, right? So I think the process of reading Lacan has also given me a real appreciation for how demanding the clinical work can really be, because my reading of Lacan has been ongoing and it's never ending. And, I'm constantly returning to texts that, I've read a bazillion times, but have been able to hear something or discern something in a very different way, in a very generative way, which is very different, I think, from a kind of perhaps more academic or, maybe philosophical reading of Lacan.
To bring just one very quick line and then another slightly longer passage from the seminar on the psychoses. Not because I have anything especially deep to say about it, but because I want it just to reverberate for our listeners along with what you're saying about the relationship between this sort of reading and clinical work. And this I was just hearing in my head, as it's not something that we read, but it is Jordy Rosenberg talking about the experience of reading Judith Butler's Gender Trouble for the first time. In fact, Rosenberg quotes Lacan in this context, do not give up on your desire. But the line I was thinking about is that reading and not understanding and keeping on reading is one of the singular pleasures and engagements of the life of the mind. And I guess the body too. And that's actually like quite a lovely sentiment. And then I wanted to juxtapose that with the beginning of chapter 3, or I guess it's the third seminar from the third installment, The Other in Psychosis. And so this is Lacan. The life of a psychoanalyst, as I was reminded by Maya Nalisans several times on the one day, isn't rosy. The comparison that can be made between the analyst and a rubbish dump is justified. All day long, in fact, he has to endure utterances that surely are of doubtful value to himself and even more so to the subject who communicates them to him. This is a feeling that the psychoanalyst, if he is a real one, has not only been accustomed to overcoming for a long time, but to be honest, it's one that he purely and simply abolishes within himself in the exercise of his practice. I must, on the other hand, say that this feeling comes alive again with all its force when one is led to go over the sum total of works that make up what is called the analytic literature. I know. It actually, it's like sick burn upon sick burn, but there is this, it actually is, that strikes me as like a very Freudian moment in some way. I'm thinking about this passage that Patrick loves to quote that's in a letter from the late Freud that's like, people are basically garbage. And it's like the metaphor is there. But, regardless of the valence, there is this sort of like tarrying with this thing that is, its relation to sense is constantly put in question. And I think that, I agree enormously that has something to do with the ethical in the context of reading and in the context of the relationship to another human, especially, although not limited to in a clinical encounter. But I also think that it just requires an enormous amount of patience. And that's, you know what I mean? That's, I don't want to go off on a whole thing about like the attention economy and whatnot, but I think there's something that's so that's so helpful in listening to you talk about the way that you're drawn to these things that do not signify in this sort of straightforward manner, and that there is, there's a capacity, and it's almost like it's a muscle, that you have to develop as well.
I wonder. What I find myself thinking about that capacity is that it's much easier both to describe and to enact the opposite of it, right? Which is the immediate sense of repulsion or the desire not to be put in that position where elasticity is required, right? That's sort of, well, I guess if we want to be kind of existential, but also I think there's probably a little of a Lacanian aspect to it, like this fundamental distress or anxiety that like, I have to process this, or this is the thing in front of me.
Yes.
And I have to bring to bear
Yes.
different ways of thinking about it while also, they're in the train with me, or they're my neighbor, or I'm treating them, or they're in my family, right? There is this kind, or maybe even it could be me, right? Though of course that gets complicated insofar as that, as you go on about a great length, part of what is at core, both I think a feature of psychotic processes, but also I think speaks to the anxiety we have about psychosis, is that inability to self-diagnose.
Yes.
And at that point, it feels like and here we can, Lacan has this line, which I won't quote specifically from the readings, where he's like the problem of psychosis, like conceptually, but I think also in the terms of like living it as a day-to-day thing, as a clinical thing, is related to, and still is, to this concept, to our anxieties about this thing called madness, right? And then madness is a term that's not, I want to be clear for listeners who may be concerned, we're not using madness in a stigmatizing way, right? In fact, there are many activists who own that term proudly, but and so madness is not synonymous with crazy, but rather it bespeaks something that has order to it, that exists, but that also it's sort of like an uncanny double of reason that makes us feel anxious, or rather it's a double of reason that makes us feel anxious about the claims of reason of our own.
Yeah.
Right. And the phrase that I oftentimes think about here, and this will pivot back to, I think, some of the material dimensions, right, is I believe it's McCary in one of his histories of forgive me, I'm forgetting this COVID brain here, but like the idea that, in which a historically pegged moment, right, at which people get minds, but you don't just get a mind, you have a mind as a thing that you can lose. So the moment like this thing is like articulated as well, this is my rationality, this is my reason, then suddenly that becomes a commodity maybe that you could be bereft of. And you could be bereft of under extremis, right? And I can think too, you could be bereft of it too under like certain conditions of what we might call like like a toxic psychosis or a temporary acute one. Like here, I think if anyone who's listening has ever had an experience with like a hallucinogenic drug, and then you hit that one moment where we open the door by talking about extremity, but if anyone's ever been on some kind of trip and then you have that brief moment where you're like, what if this is just how it's going to be going forward, right? Well, what if time and what if people's faces are going to be melting forever? What if actually this person that I think is my friend was secretly is not my friend, but a robot, right? And that moment of like, blessedly, in my experience, at least those moments recede with as your liver or whatever processes, whatever it is. But the terror that strikes in you, right? Like that fear, even in a deranged toxic sense, I think can be analogized to the anxiety that we have around thinking about madness or unreason. And even sometimes tragically, many psychoanalysts who are supposedly so versed in thinking about the unconscious can still have anxieties about being near unreason. And as your work makes very clear, though, these aren't even just questions of theory or of disposition, right? Of whether or not we can sit with someone, or whether, as a clinician, or whether or not we can understand what's happening with someone as we write about theoretically, but they also out in enactments on the realm of public policy, where it's like, well, here's a problem, throw this person in an institution, get them off the train. They're not like, remember those distinctions between when that fellow was shot in the New York City subway, between like New Yorkers and this person who was a schizophrenic. It's like, well, no, he was a New Yorker too. Or commuters versus a person who was just homeless. Okay, well, great. He wasn't a property owner, but he was also going somewhere on that train. But we immediately start sorting in this way that has to do with, I think, pushing away that very anxiety.
There are certain analytic traditions that argue, that this comes out of the Kleinian and post-Kleinian tradition, particularly, in various ways of saying that there's something psychotic in human subjectivity itself, a psychotic core, or for Kleinians, there's always, even in so-called kind of higher functioning or neurotic people, there's a lot of psychotic phenomena, paranoid, schizoid phenomena that happen psychically and in transference and so forth. that idea was something that Lacan was sort of, particularly in his commentary on Klein, he was very appreciative of Klein, and had many good things to say about Klein's work. But one doesn't see that kind of language in Lacan or in the Lacanian tradition, something like we're all just sort of mad, like in a certain way. And yet there are certain coordinates in Lacan that point to, I think, something similar, or something that touches on what these other analysts are trying to get at, which is that anxiety and angst is an inescapable experience of the human being when encountering desire. What is difficult for the psychotic person, if one chooses the path of psychosis as opposed to maybe the path of neurosis, is that they cannot name or find a name to orient the desire of the other that allows them to orient themselves as a subject, right? Neurotics just, neurotics repress this. We can kind of forget about it until we can't. But there's something fundamentally difficult for the psychotic to find a symbolic anchor for themselves when encountering the other. But that anxiety that Freud described as the kind of helplessness, right, of the infant, or Lacan describes as the anxiety and the encounter with the other and the desire of the other. That is that's a basic anxiety. Right? That's a basic anxiety, and the analyst is not, despite Lacan's kind of suggestion in that passage that Abby read, the analyst is not exempt from that anxiety.
Right.
There's a really, we found this kind of remarkable passage in one of Lacan's later talks. I think it's entitled like A Speech to Psychiatrists or something like that, from the 70s, where he describes the anxiety or the angst of the analyst or the psychiatrist in front of the psychotic subject, which is, probably the first time you would ever sort of see Lacan speak to a kind of affect that the analyst experiences, right? And Matthew and I had kind of done some work and presented a paper on this very classic psychiatric concept of Precox Gefühl, or feeling, the Precox feeling, which describes this kind of phenomenological experience of what it's like to sit with a psychotic person. This sense of disorientation, of inability to make a certain contact. And that, for classically, people would sort of use that, particularly in the phenomenological tradition, as a kind of indicator of something of the subjective structure of the person in front of them. The other association I had was, we all, in the city environment, in the urban environment, this is why we were kind of drawn to writing this particular paper and kind of thinking about this in our own clinical work. We encounter psychotic people on the corners, on our way to work, outside of restaurants, in the subway. And everybody has that sort of awkward, disorienting experience of this, where there's so many overdetermined questions in those very brief encounters, right? What's my responsibility in this, right? Not just in the reality of this person being here, right? Maybe unhoused or whatever that may be. What's my responsibility right now? And is it my responsibility? Or how is it my responsibility? And if it's not mine, then whose, right? But there's so much, I think, that happens in these moments, including anxiety, in many cases. To your point, Patrick, that we lean on civilization to address. And that's been a mistake in many regards, right? Or it's, to your point, Patrick, that, our own psychical anxieties find their way into how civilization itself manages madness or relates to madness. And this is also very basic Freud makes a point like this in Civilization's Discontents, except that he kind of puts the burden on the person who chooses to either basically succumb to the demands of civilization or choose. Well, he goes through a whole list of, it's one of my favorite passages, alcoholism.
Oh, life is too hard for us.
Life is too hard.
Yep.
And he calls these, in this almost like
I love this
Foucauldian-like
passage.
language, these techniques of living.
Yeah. Drugs is
One of them is neurosis, or you can withdraw from the world in madness, right? But he kind of puts it on the person, right? Like sort of that subjective choice one makes, which, there is something important in that idea. But I think we have to be also thinking of how civilization makes it constitutively impossible to be mad and to live.
I remembered what he says. I'm so sorry. It's palliative measures.
Yeah.
Yes.
We cannot do without certain palliative measures. I may be like mildly mangling it, but it is palliative measures.
And one of those very nice understated terms of Freud's, So yeah, I think we were sort of approaching this paper and some of these ideas. We had to look to traditions that followed Lacan. Something to remember with Lacan is that even up to the end of his life, despite the kind of theory that he developed and how associated he was to certain intellectual circuits, he was a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
He was always a psychiatrist. And they've actually begun translating these consultations he did in the 70s at St. Anne's Hospital, where people still do these. I've participated in these, where they kind of bring up some patient in front of an audience of other clinicians and students, and somebody interviews them and then said some smart things about the case afterwards. He did a series of these, and they've now been translated for English speakers to be able to read. And you see a psychiatrist at work, you see somebody who's not particularly hopeful that these people have any real future. This was, I think, from what I can tell, this was something of Lacan's attitude throughout his work. Both this kind of famous request that analysts do not turn their back on psychosis, right? Something of an ethical ask that analysts face it directly in ways that civilization, psychiatry cannot. And yet these sort of weird anecdotes where he seems to be not super optimistic about particular psychotic people. He actually met Artaud very early in Artaud's life and said something like, "This man will live forever and not write a single thing." When in fact Artaud did the exact opposite. He wrote a lot and died quite early. So I'm just saying this, that I'm one of the things that I've been try to be very honest with myself about is that we can't idealize Lacan as a practitioner, even if the theory gives us certain coordinates to work. And so you have to, I think, also turn to some of his students who would elaborate this work in very creative ways, and most of which always involve some kind of institutional or collective setting.
Yeah.
And so what we started to get at this paper is what is that question of the collective, both in a very material sense, but also how can we theorize this, or how can we theorize the necessity of introducing the collective in the work with psychosis? And we just needed more reference points than, reading Seminar 3.
Yeah.
Or the Joyce Seminar or something like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's interesting. I think, for so many people, Lacan is so identified with the return to Freud and the insistence on not being a Lacanian, you all can be Lacanians, I'm a Freudian. But it's such a departure from Freud. And, Lacan is very snarky in a lot of his writing, but he's never snarky about Freud. But he is in the seminar on the psychoses. He's very clear that, Freud was not interested in working with psychotics.
Yes.
And I think as a result of that that position, which has had huge repercussions for psychoanalysis and for talk therapy in general, a lot of our listeners are going to find the idea of talk therapy, let alone, classical psychoanalysis or anything like that, with psychotic patients improbable or at the least surprising. And it's really at odds with common ideas about psychosis and
Yes.
with common ideas about what psychoanalysis is and what it's good for, like what it
Yes.
does. And so I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I want us to just sort of make our way in whatever fashion works well, but in this sort of like a sort of shared pedagogical responsibility kind of way, for digging into at least the Lacanian text. And you, Loren, I will put you on the spot to ask you about, a little bit about how it's good to work with.
Mhm.
So here's what I want to get out on the table for all of our listeners. First of all, what is it that Lacan has to say about psychosis? I realize this is like an unanswerable question in, 15 to 20 minutes or whatever, but I want to see if we can get some of the sort of fundamental lineaments of that out for our listeners. Again, because it's such an enormous departure from Freud in this figure who's really identified with the return to Freud. I'm interested in why you specifically find him helpful to think with when it comes to theorizing psychosis and to working with psychotic patients.
Yes.
I'm interested in asking what about the Lacanian approach clinically distinguishes it from other psychodynamic methodologies. And before I completely overwhelm everybody with questions, one more. I want to see if we can talk about transference in particular in working with psychosis in the clinical setting. And we may want to get into some of the really rich historical antecedents for that as well.
Yes, absolutely. So one area I might push back a little bit on, and where he does and doesn't depart from Freud, is that, or maybe another way to say it is, in some ways he departs from Freud quite radically around psychosis. And in some ways he attempts to kind of, as he does in many other ways, tries to use Freud, in ways that Freud himself wasn't able to kind of use certain ideas of his own, right? Like certain limitations to Freud's own use of Freudian theory.
Yes.
So just to be specific, Lacan entirely disagreed with Freud's conceptualization of psychosis as in relationship to homosexuality.
Right.
This was not for Lacan, a very compelling sort of explanation of etiology or for psychosis.
So yeah, for those people who are curious, where in Freud talks about psychotic phenomena, right, and psychosis in this sense, if we're defining it as a disorder, like a osis of the psyche, right, a disorder of this thing called the psyche, which cashes out in a non-relation or a fundamentally divergent relationship with reality from consensus norms, right? Freud doesn't really deal with it very much. And the only real extended place he does is through the readings of the memoirs of Judge Daniel Paul Schreber and Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. And that is worthy of several episodes on its own. And perhaps you might come back for a close reading of some of that, Loren. But the TLDR basically is that it's a case where Freud doesn't have a case. He actually works with a text and he reads this sort of essentially graphomaniacal sort of account of this man's series of breakdowns and flights into health and other sort of tragic life circumstances. And Freud, who only has this book in front of him and also very signally has no awareness of Daniel Paul Schreber's actual upbringing in a tremendous, almost cartoonishly abusive household with a cartoonishly abusive, monstrous father, essentially concludes in the way that we were talking about earlier. Like, you look for the master signified, you make a fit of theory. It's like, well, this is really about a repressed homosexuality and a whole series of other things. And I've made these interpretations, but also in general, I could only do this because I had this text, and people like this, they don't form transferential relationships with you. They'll come into your office and they'll be like talking to God instead of you, or they'll pretend you aren't there. Therefore, this is the exception that proves the rule that not even Freud can analyze these people.
Yes.
But that it's all about sex anyway. So he both vindicates himself and steps outside of it.
Yeah.
Yes. And, as early as 1910, some of Freud's contemporaries and students were already disagreeing and beginning clinics to work analytically with psychotic people. So the other point where Lacan definitely diverges from Freud is this argument that there's no transference in psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every analytic school would disagree with this, right? It would work with psychotic people. Freud was very sort of like said something to the effect of, I just don't like sitting with these people, right? They just upset me too much. So, he was not in the kind of clinical milieu of working with psychosis. And so, yes, relies on this autobiographical text of Schreber's. But he was certainly familiar with the academic and psychiatric writings on psychosis. Bloiler was his student and so forth. And so, he later will kind of write these two papers on neurosis and psychosis, and in some ways kind of backs off from the homosexuality kind of ideology and kind of gets more at the descriptive level of how the psychotic relates to reality and how the neurotic relates to reality. And those are helpful papers. This is where you kind of see a distinction between neurotic symptoms and psychotic symptoms. This is where I think Lacan still tries to remain somewhat faithful to Freud, is to delineate the structures of neurosis and psychosis through the different, for lack of a better word, defenses at play between the two. So famously, Lacan develops this idea of the foreclosure of the name of the father, which he reads from Freud's, Freud uses various terms for this, but in the Wolfman case, it's, translates as kind of rejection or repudiation. Sometimes he speaks about expulsion, words like expulsion, sometimes disavowal, which gets confusing because he kind of uses that in different contexts around perversion. But essentially, this idea of foreclosure, which Lacan borrowed both from two French linguists as well as from French juridical terminology, was his translation of these various terms that Freud used for a much more radical rejection of a piece of reality, psychical reality, that is different from the negations involved in repression and neurotic subjects. Other psychoanalytic schools, in their own ways have comparable ideas. People would speak of in kind of post-Freudian circles of denial, radical denial, a kind of very primitive form of denial, as being primary in psychotic people. But the foreclosure of the name of the father for Lacan was an inability to, in Freudian language, resolve the Oedipus complex in a way that a neurotic might. So one of the divergences that Lacan makes from Freud, which really opens up a lot of different ways of thinking about a greater diversity of clinical material and social and cultural factors and history, I think, is that he refuses to limit the Oedipus complex to the family. Right? This is a kind of a blind spot for Freud. So when Lacan speaks about the foreclosure of the name of the father, he's not speaking about fathers per se. He's very clear in early texts, and this is something I always teach students, very closely, is that his inheritance of anthropology, structuralism, structural anthropology of Lévi-Strauss allows him to differentiate the symbolic function from the real person, right? Or even the image of the person. And he's able then to reorder some of Freudian theory around the Oedipus complex in a way that doesn't trap us into the drama of the nuclear family, of the genitals and who has which genitals, and so forth. So for those who are not that familiar with Lacan, you see these terms in his thinking, the name of the father, the phallus, that seem to be, very caught up in the same heteronormative, biases of Freud. But in reality, one is able to see them just as signifiers that allow them to have a function in many different kinds of specific contexts, right? Okay, so the name of the father for Lacan means that there is a kind of transcendental point that allows a subject to enter the symbolic world in a way where they can ground themselves with a sense of history, a sense of inheritance, a sense of relationships to others, a sense of being able to decode certain linguistic, cultural, symbolic exchanges around them. That actually gives a kind of, and this is something Lacan will later suggest around foreclosure, is that there's a loss of a kind of faith in the symbolic, that there's not a grounding law, right, in the symbolic. That when somebody gives a gift to another person, just as a kind of banal example, psychotic subjects might really struggle with deciphering or comprehending the groundedness, the symbolic groundedness of the gift, for example, or, why somebody, engages in a certain kind of day-to-day symbolic gesture or something like that. So in Lacan's, not quite developmental perspective, but, sort of nod to Freud, one could think of this as, a child who is at the mercy of another's enjoyment, body, desire, without a reference point that allows them to find a different position, to desire in a way that's not unmediated by the other, right? In Freudian language, this is the kind of classic problem of not separating from the mother, right? And Lacan still uses this terminology, but I think, it's important to sort of see this more as functions and structure, so that we're not bound to a particular kind of historical moment or configuration of kinship or the family and so forth.
To put a point on that maybe just to further, again, to not entirely straw manning Freud, but I think actually perhaps somewhat fairly presenting Freud, right? If in a crude way of telling it, for Freud, this thing called sort of Oedipus, right? The Oedipal challenge, right, is that moment in which the child, and note, this invokes all those implicit riders or caveats about gendered and sexed bodies and family structures that Loren was just talking about, right? It's when the young child, exemplarily, it's a young boy, and then for a young girl, we have to do additional work. It's a young boy in a situation that is taken to be patriarchal and in which heteronormativity is taken to be the default force of how subjectivities are sort of like aligned and desires are coordinated. It's essentially the child having to encounter, in the mode of a difficult challenge, the refusal on the part of some person, quintessentially the father, right, in this particular saying, no, you cannot have unmediated access to this mother. No, actually, she's not going to come. She's not going to put you to bed tonight. I'm being crude about this, but like, she's not putting you to bed tonight because tonight is date night for us, right? And the way this is structured, right, is essentially, again, sort of crudely, is that Freud has hanging on this everything from, well, the prohibition against incest in a family, i.e., no, this is a person who you should not be having sex with, mom. That's dad's job, right? And it's sort of a generational ordering, to also like entering into what later feminist critics like Oury will astutely call out as like, this is a figuration of the like the marriage market, or like women as objects of
Yes, the
exchange.
exchange of women.
Yeah. I.e., you can't have mom, and it's because there is this one mom you can't have, this one lady you can't have, that you get to have all the other ladies as a possibility, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
of course, this of course is very crude immediately when we start considering the fact that, I don't know, actually incest does happen in families. Sometimes mothers do abuse their kids, but also too, and this is, I think, the virtue of the Lacanian turn in this, is that if we structuralize this more broadly, so it's not about like access to mom as the person who was previously feeding you but now has to go watch a romantic movie with dad or whatever, but literally just, it's, if we structuralize out all those things that were previously doing the positive content for Freud of his system of like the Oedipus myth or not your mom or not incest, and instead to be like, oh, this is about the entry into some sort of what is deemed to be constitutive collective reality, right? Which has to obey certain laws, above all involving the capacity of exchange, the what you might call the fungibility of persons, right? Or certain sort of appropriate ways of coordinating relationships. Then that challenge takes on a lot more existential, but also potentially diagnostic work. And this might, lead to situations like, and I'm thinking about the example of giving a gift is such a really good example, right? That if I see you after a book talk and I give you a rose, right? We can all, in the world of like, I don't know, like adult people who have crossed over some sort of Oedipal boundary, like, oh, this is a flirtatious gesture, right? Or this is a guest-host relationship, etc. In other words, because we've had this thing, we've entered into a system of exchange through this process of creating us as subjects, of being subjectivized, we can then sort of exchange other things, whether they be literal gifts, but also tokens and words. But I think what you're calling us to consider, and what Lacan is calling us to consider, are circumstances in which a person, and it's I want to be clear too that I'm not saying this is not a diagnostic thing. So like if you have an Oedipal victory, if you actually do sleep with mom, God forbid, you are necessarily going to be psychotic per se, right? But rather that there is adults can, under certain circumstances, enter into a relationship with reality, or whatever we deem to be collective reality, with all the anxieties that entails, where those things just don't stack up in the same way. The systems of exchange, the logics of substitutability, the notion even of like loss don't track the same way. And that's different from repression. It's this thing called foreclosure, which has all these senses, both of like financial, but also literally as like, I don't know, like the opposite of enclosure, as both the historic process of bringing in the commons, but also of like shutting down a space. So it shuts down this. So one way I think maybe we could think about this is psychosis, or at least insofar as foreclosure is part of psychosis, it seems to raise the question of a collapse of the possibility of a shared space or dimensionality of relating, or what normatively might be considered normal relating.
Yes. Something I would add, and this is something that you see in, without taking us too far afield here, but something Lacan emphasized, which I do think is a very important borrowing from the psychiatric tradition, is that there are certain elementary phenomena in psychosis. And this is clinically important because, this allows somebody to, let's say you're working with an adolescent, if you're kind of aware or kind of listening for certain elementary phenomena, you might discern or be, you might be entertaining the possibility this person has a psychotic structure and could have a psychotic crisis. One of the primary of these elementary phenomena is around self-reference. And the reason I'm bringing this up is to your point, Patrick, and I like how you summarize that. It's important in Lacan's thinking that it's not the father's no, which, in the French also sounds like name and no, right? It's not just the no prohibiting the child from having the mother's body, right? Or being everything, right, to the mother. It's a prohibition on the mother's desire and enjoyment as well, right? Which again sounds, archaically sounds, really suspect. But, again, in the structural sense or the broader sense, it allows the child to be given a space from the persecutory and omnipotent enjoyment of the other, So if you are raised in circumstances, and this is where you can look at specific life histories and so forth, there are conditions in which one is not able to give name to a place or even a space, as you pointed out, Patrick, that is allows mediation between the subject and the enjoyment of the other. Lacan emphasized that it's the mother who is omnipotent, right, to the child. She seems capricious. She sort of wants the child to be all hers, and yet she leaves. She offers the breast kind of seemingly whimsically and not when the child actually is asking for it always, right? And this is where it almost gets kind of Kleinian, is that, for Lacan, especially in the early work, this is an experience of an introduction to the other as overpowering, as, almost sadistic, omnipotent, even kind of cruel. These are the experiences of a subject who becomes psychotic, right? This is the ideas of reference, right? That one has lost the ability to forget the other's enjoyment, right? And that it becomes very centered upon the subject. So Lacan actually gives a very nice example in that seminar of the person who sees a red car.
Yeah.
I think it's a red car pass. And something about it being a red car has a meaning to the person that's enigmatic, that raises a perplexity in them. And perplexity is another elementary phenomenon that one sees often before a psychotic episode. This is not a perplexity of like, oh, I wonder what my wife is thinking about right now, right? This is a much more ontologically unsettling perplexity. Something about that red car has something to do with me, right? This is a very specific example of where something of, again, a reference point that mediates the other is failing. The rose that you're giving me is not, a gesture, to neurotics. It's seductive, but there also could be other kind of overdetermined, metaphorical kinds of things compacted in that transaction, right? A psychotic person might be utterly sort of perplexed by this and will then, in order to give something like an interpretation for that perplexity, might form a delusional belief about it, even if it's just fleeting, right? But that question of why are you giving me this rose takes on a much more terrifying, disruptive signification for the psychotic subject.
Yeah. I also like the red car example. I found it clarifying. And Lacan spins this out. I mean, I actually really recommend, especially, I recommend this seminar. It's got a lot more short declarative sentences than your average, um, like excursus into like
Yes.
Lacan's world. But it, among other things, it's really a place where he spends a lot of time in some quite concrete ways spinning out the relationship between what he calls the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. And the
Yes.
symbolic is, Loren and Patrick have been talking about, le nom du père, the entrance into the symbolic, which is the entrance into language also. And I think it's one thing that I think Lacan walks this very fine line, and he does it really well here. And this also, to me, points to one of the reasons why we might want to turn to him as somebody who is a theorist of language, I think, par excellence among psychoanalysts, who generally are people who are pretty attuned to language and to utterances. And but he is like le maître, right, in that respect. Because what you're getting is this sort of double movement of him talking not only about psychotics as having a particular relationship to the symbolic, which is in some ways super saturated, right? So if I see a red car go down the street, I might in fact say, hey, that's a red car. but I don't believe that it is a sign of something. And for Lacan, the redness of the car, it is always already meaningful. So there's this way in which, for the psychotic, in the way that he's talking about it, there is a super saturation of meaning that is actually the problem. And then the sort of double movement here, though, is because there is some sort of, like, it's not just a simple kind of, there's no rapprochement with the symbolic. He's not saying like there is no contact with reality where reality involves the ability to symbolize. In some ways, it's too much, right? There's too much meaning. Everything is meaningful in a way that relates back to the self. And this is also part of the trouble, he says, for us, is that because actually, I mean, he says in this way, I don't have the passage right in front of me. I've been looking for it, and this is in like 6-point font that we printed it out, and I can't find it. It's something like, well, actually, you are talking to a psychotic patient, and they do sound like you, right? And so this is a problem of understanding, and the greatest problem is that you think you do understand. So, I mean, I don't know. It's a remarkable seminar.
It's a passage where he's critiquing Jaspers, who I mentioned the precox feeling earlier, and Jaspers had this kind of similar idea, which is that when you're speaking with a psychotic subject, you can't understand them.
Right.
It's a little tricky because I don't think Jaspers meant it in the sense of comprehension. I think it was something more like empathy, like you couldn't kind of connect empathically or experientially with the psychotic person. But you're right. This is the point where Lacan argues that we can't take the reference around understanding to be kind of the way we can kind of approach this, right?
When I was talking before about him threading this needle, the other thing that I think is important here is that there's a danger in setting up this sort of distinctive relationship to the symbolic as also seeing it as a sort of privileged relationship to the real. Like, and I think you do see this in a lot of tropes of like the mad artist who it's like, you must suffer because only knowing that true like that real truth about the world. Like, and Lacan avoids that idealization of psychosis while still maintaining that there's a distinctive relationship to the symbolic. And that I think is super, super important.
Yes, that's very important.
I found the line in the Lacan, and it's this bit about, and you're right. I think it would not surprise me if this is a polemical deformation of the Jaspers. I mean, this is the same way he deals with Klein. Like, it's always a little bit of a polemical, but it's like
a misreading, probably deliberate misreading. Yes,
it's about this idea of the relation of understanding, which in this account, Freud says, is Jaspers has made the cornerstone of all psychopathology, and it consists. And here again, we're not really talking about Jaspers. We're talking about this sort of error of thought, or this sort of tendency to a type of all too easy objectivity, or a type of flight into models, but also is basically an assumption that you're in the same symbolic order as everybody else, right? Or that you have the same relationship to it. And here he is. It consists in thinking that some things are self-evident. That, for example, when someone is sad, it's because he doesn't have what his heart desires. But nothing could be more false. There are people who have all their heart desires and are still sad. Sadness is a passion of quite another color. And I think that gets it. Sometimes I kind of feel like it's like a fish nibbling away at different parts of things, and only it's sort of like you get it through sort of as it emerges through relief or through the little bits that he nibbles on it. But it's like
that's like both gross and accurate.
Yeah, I think actually at some point even I have a friend who translates Lacan and also classical poetry, classical Chinese, like Zhuangzi stuff, and he came across this long reference where Lacan describes himself as like the analyst must lay like a fish who is half dead and waits for its prey. And he's like, what is this? And he actually opened up something in Zhuangzi, which apparently, like Lacan was reading at the time, was about this mythical fish that lives on the bottom of a lake, and it lets other fish come up to it and nibble on it and get closer and closer and nibble a little bit and eat a little bit and eat a little bit. And just when the fish thinks it's safe, then the big fish reveals that it's not dead by eating the other fish, right? And that's supposedly how an interpretation is supposed to work. I don't know. It's funny.
That's really not what I want my therapist to be.
But what seems to be a
makes me think of the Sopranos fish.
Oh yeah, the thing about Billy Bass.
Yes.
But yeah, it is this like, or elsewhere, Lacan also talks about like, how do we know when someone is speaking that they're talking to us, right? They could just be producing words, but it's not necessarily. So it's sort of like, if we think about, I'm trying to paraphrase this again, hopefully not too crudely and not doing violence to you or Lacan or anyone else. It's like, if communication in this kind of consensus reality it's not just an exchange of tokens, it's an exchange of token and reference in a certain type of hierarchy where certain things are understood to be logical consequence or correlatives of one another. And what that relies on is some sort of structuring principle, right? That initial, where we agree that something means something else and other things hang on other things. But as we are describing the problem or the challenge of psychotic reasoning or of being in a psychotic moment, it's that coordination of different meanings, or even like that pole star that hangs everything, could be something very different. It could be there's a contingency to it, or it could track to a certain trauma. But in any event, it's not transparently accessible as legible to the person who is sitting across from a psychotic patient and who seems to be the object of their speech, but who they may actually not be talking to.
Yes.
And that will also then apply to the interpretation the analyst makes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of getting us a little bit into the question of transference. Patrick, your idea that the psychotic subject in front of the analyst or the whatever interlocutor it is, there might be this sense that there's a question of who the addressee might be, right? It almost makes me think of like, kind of Wittgensteinian private language or something like that, right? I'm entirely in agreement, Abby, with your point that Lacan does not romanticize psychosis, that, there's some access to some, sort of transcendental real that, but something that's been elaborated in the sort of post-Lacanian literature, there's this really, if you haven't read it, it's a fantastic book by Brett Fimiani, who's been a really wonderful friend in this work. It's on the psychoanalytic treatment of psychosis in extreme states. And, thinking about transference, he does make this argument, which I do think is very grounded in Lacan, including his passages we're looking at more closely, which is that there is a knowledge of the psychotic subject that betrays something about the foundation of the law, of the symbolic law. What I mean by that, in your case, Patrick, this idea that, the psychotic person when speaking may not be speaking to the analyst. Nobody speaks to the analyst pure and simply, right? This is kind of the point of the big other that Lacan introduces, in a sense, is that there's a kind of locus that one addresses their speech to, that may be kind of embodied by another person like the analyst, but always sort of reaches past the analyst, right? They're addressing a place more than a person, right? But in psychosis, that becomes more manifest. This is something of how psychosis betrays something of the unconscious in neurotics, right? Something in relation to a certain truth about the symbolic that neurotics can kind of get away with kind of ignoring or kind of, because egos are kind of stronger for neurotics, can kind of operate in this sort of more illusory world in which, I say this to you and you know what it means, and you know that I know what it means, and so forth. And we can kind of just go on with our day without worrying about it too much. There's a nice little quip in this seminar where Lacan describes the unconscious of the psychotic, and it's translated differently, of like either out in the open or like an open sky.
Yeah.
And so something Brett in his book suggests is that in working with a psychotic subject, the subject supposed to know is the psychotic subject in the transference.
I'm gonna have to think about that for a while.
So we could maybe take a step back in terms of Lacan's theory of the transference, which is really developed mostly in, I think, thinking about working with neurotics, where he defines the transference as in two ways. One is the enactment of the unconscious. It famously kind of puts the analyst in this place as the subject supposed to know. This idea, I think, has been somewhat, in my opinion, misread in different ways, because any clinician knows that the transference of a neurotic has many kind of imaginary elements to it. A lot of narcissistic projections, you remind me of my father, or you must be judging me right now, because you think I'm such a piece of shit, all this kind of thing. Or, this guy went to Columbia, so he must know a thing or two about me, or, he's well versed in blah, 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 or he's a big figure in the analytic community. I think sometimes this idea the subject's supposed to know is kind of read more in this imaginary sense that, the transference is that the analyst embodies something around, a figure of knowledge, and they can. That certainly can be a part of it. But also plenty of analysans patients don't think you know too much, right? They're not all impressed by you, right? There are all kinds of imaginary aspects of the transference that every analytic tradition speaks to. And one of Lacan's critique of many of them is that they can't quite think past just the imaginary element, right? So you have Kleinians who, and maybe you'll cut this because maybe I'm being too catty, but you have Kleinians who might, the dream, the shed that's in the dream is about the analyst, right? You're complaining about your coworkers at work when you're really complaining about the analyst, right? That just bring everything back to that aspect of the transference in a way that's not so different from the psychotic who thinks the red car is about them. Right? So there's a bit, arguably something kind of psychotic in working that way in certain traditions. What I think Lacan is really getting at with the subject supposed to know is more that something happens in a treatment, in the development of a transference, when the analyst, less the person of the analyst, but more of their position, what they say, what they don't say, what they choose to intervene on or interpret, starts to agitate or almost become a kind of agent provocateur of the analysan's unconscious. So it may not take the form of a kind of projection or this idea that, oh, you can read right through me or you must know what's in my unconscious. It may do that, but I think that's a bit more of a kind of imaginary construction than what really is at stake, which is that something of the unconscious starts to be listened to and then opened up in a way. And many people have this experience. They begin an analysis and they start dreaming again, when they haven't remembered a dream for years and years and years. That something's getting kind of under your skin, something's kind of being opened up in the transference at the symbolic level, right? In the sense of the unconscious. Okay, so Brett's point about kind of reversing this, I think in some ways points to an ethical position of the analyst, which is that, in treating psychosis, the analyst has to be extra careful not to embody a place of all-knowing, right? Because that will be met with likely persecutory anxiety for a psychotic person. I'm going to tell you what this means,
right?
Would be very unsettling. And this is sort of all of the kind of classical things about how psychotics cannot be treated by analysis is what analysts mean when they say that, I think, is that they can't be treated like a neurotic in an analysis. So you wouldn't, for example, point to a signifier that you hear as enigmatic in the psychotic speech, right? Because, maybe this is kind of obvious, but that's where kind of understanding something of what the relationship to the symbolic is for the psychotic person is so important, because it can really determine how you work with somebody with psychosis. So you're not taking the kind of hermeneutics of suspicion approach, right? The kind of guided
Right.
paranoia that Lacan mentions in an early paper. You take something more of a, a position of a hermeneutics of trust, or even Nev Jones, who's a fantastic researcher in Pittsburgh, and she herself has had lived experience with psychosis. And she said to me in a conversation, it's really it's an ethics of epistemic sacrifice on the part of the person, whether it's a therapist or anybody else, with the psychotic person, right?
Yeah.
So Brett's getting at something like, in working with the psychotic subject, the subject's supposed to know is the psychotic insofar as the knowledge that they transmit through delusions or disorganized speech or whatever it may be is a knowledge that is not graspable for neurotic people. It's a knowledge about the foundation of the law, which is that the law doesn't really have a foundation other than an act of faith in a sense. And that's what we sort of are helping with the psychotic to organize or to name in a particular way, but more at the level of stabilizing rather than pointing to an unconscious, wish or another possible chain of significations and so forth.
I want to come back to where we started, which is the paper that we read of yours for today that you co-authored with Matthew Oyer, The Risk of Space, Toward a Treatment of Psychosis in the City, which, as I said, I admired so much. And I'm hoping that you can sketch out for our listeners a little bit about the arguments that you outline in that piece.
Yeah.
And in particular, I'm hoping you can talk about the way that the essay intervenes in New York City Mayor Eric Adams's proposals for aggressive mental health interventions, and the ways in which you draw inspiration from French examples, particularly from institutional psychiatry and sector psychiatry.
Well, we wrote this on the heels of Eric Adams' 2022 reinterpretation of the law that expanded the ability for the police and social welfare agents to involuntarily refer people to psychiatric emergency rooms and possibly for inpatient treatment. It was a very controversial policy and remains to be so. And as we've seen in California with Gavin Newsom, is presented in a kind of humanitarian language, right?
Yeah.
You may think you're basically saying to people who care for the unhoused and psychotic people that you're letting them kind of die in their own filth on the streets because you don't want them to get care. They're incapable of seeking care. They don't have the resources, and so we need more flexibility and intervening. And they developed I believe 2 lists of kind of their primary suspects that they wanted to kind of get into treatment. And there have been many reporters who have been attempting to get some information about what's actually happened to these individuals. And unsurprisingly, the city is not sharing that. But, we wrote it with that as a backdrop. And in some ways, in thinking back on the paper, it's a bit of a red herring because much of what we argue in the paper is that the systems of treatment in place, even before this change in policy, are really designed to induce hopelessness and exhaustion on the part of those who are attempting to treat such people, and even more so, designed to extract value from these people who are suffering. And this is where we leaned on the Health Communism
Right.
book by Vera Kant and Adler Bolton, and particularly their idea of extractive abandonment, the creation of surplus populations that can then be the source of profit for healthcare industries, for nonprofit industries, and so forth, requiring such people to be sick and unhoused and in need. And what happens is, when people enter care, and this has been the case for a very long time since deinstitutionalization in the United States, they kind of get lost to this kind of bureaucratic circuit of care in which one might be encountering isolated, well-intentioned people who are helping with mental health care or medical care or social services or housing, and they get lost in the shuffle. This is what the anthropologist Ken Hopper called the institutional circuit. He's done ethnographies of this care in New York City and all of the sort of policy failures that have come in the wake of deinstitutionalization. So people just go from one place to another. There's no communication between, the sites where they're receiving services, shelter to the hospital, to the transition housing, to, the social worker. And they're there in perpetuity. There's no exit. So we were really thinking, what is possible in the city, in the specific politics of the city, and also just the geopolitics and the spatial politics of cities themselves, and thinking about this problem and beginning to think of it analytically, or how can we kind of think of reinventing treatment with this backdrop. Matthew and I kind of stumbled across, through the work of Camille Robesy, the tradition of institutional psychotherapy. And this was, again, kind of a return to origins for both of us, because as I mentioned, I had been interested in Deleuze and Guattari in college, and Guattari's work came out of the tradition of institutional psychotherapy. Most date the origins of institutional psychotherapy to François Tosquelles, who was a Catalan psychiatrist who fled fascist Spain and took over the Saint Alban Hospital in France, where he immediately reorganized the system of care to be collective, non-hierarchical, with a large amount of patient autonomy, informing a clubhouse. And this is where he trained Jean Oury, who was a young psychiatrist, student of Lacan, I think also an analysand of Lacan. And Oury would then leave Saint Alban and open up Laborde, which was an old castle, where he developed a clinic that was grounded in the principles of institutional psychotherapy and what he learned from Tosquelles. So at Laborde, people who visit Laborde often didn't know who the staff were and who the patients were.
Right.
They all wore the same dress, same clothing. People would circulate through different roles in the hospital, in the clinic. So you would have psychiatrists who would take on the role of working in the kitchen or cleaning. And the aim was to really begin to address the institutional inertia that made it impossible to effectively treat people with psychosis. And to do so, they relied on the work of the collective.
Yes.
And one of the crucial ideas that Oury developed from Tosquelles, which really goes back to Bloyler's idea that dissociation is a fundamental symptom of psychosis, is what Oury would call the burst transference or the dissociated transference. And I think they meant specific to schizophrenic subjects, psychotic subjects, which you often find that schizophrenic subjects will develop transferences to multiple objects, including non-human objects, right? And so the idea of doing collective work in such a way would be that these transferences can be deployed in a collective setting, but listened to and worked through analytically, right? So something that would happen at the board would be that the analysts, the cooks, other people involved, the nurses, would do a lot of work among themselves to bring together all of these dissociated transferences and listen to them together, right? To try to give a kind of containment to the dissociation, but it would require a collectivity to do so. And in doing so, it would allow something of the psychotic patient's experience to enter into a symbolic circulation between people. And that's a very crucial idea in institutional psychotherapy, and the work of Oury was circulation.
Yeah. Yeah. And what he calls heterogeneity, right? That seemed to be when I was reading
Yes.
that Oury interview, which is wonderful, by the way, and
Yeah.
the title, "The Hospital is Ill."
Yeah.
There is this,
Yes.
in order to treat the patients, we have to reimagine the hospital, the locus of
The
treatment.
hospital, the institution has to be able to have a kind of auto-critique or a capacity to treat itself,
Yeah.
right? Which is a kind of ethical task.
Yeah, but I was just thinking about the way that you in thinking about what you're talking about as the institutional circuit,
Yes.
all of this,
Yes.
and the sheer homogeneity
Yeah.
Yes.
of that is something that has to be combated by what Oury
Yeah.
is he's talking about heterogeneity, and this reminded me so much of when we were talking to Kevin Duong about the
Mhm.
Lafargue Clinic, and there's this almost sort of cultivation of the conditions of the possibility for encounter, again born out of
Yep.
necessity, but it's also there's a strong, there's a really robust theoretical underpinning to this, which is that there is something about the sameness of
Mhm.
the institution that
Yep.
has to be combated, and that also you can't stage an encounter, but you
Yeah.
can stage the conditions of an encounter.
Yeah.
And
That's right.
I
The
think
encounter is contingent,
Yeah.
right.
but the space is not.
And
Exactly.
that's radically different too than, and here I'm going back to like how it's easier to think about the negative response to the thing than what the positive actual engagement of it would be. But it's very hard. It's very easy to see how that impulse to, well, not relate, but also to sort of to circulate people through institutions in a very sort of quick way, where even individual people who have the best, people who have the best possible intentions, right, are exhausted and depleted by it too,
Yes.
stands against that. And here, I think we can be very granular about this, and also I think historicize it, because in some ways I think the history of deinstitutionalization, for better and for worse, is also a history of sort of neoliberal infrastructure defunding and of a
Yep.
turn to the carceral state, as basically the managers of all mental health crises, right? Is this idea then that, well, if in the model that we're talking about, I think Adams himself represents like a hypertrophied sort of grotesque version of this problem, right? I mean, the man literally thinks he's on of like this madness that we're talking about, right? Because the man literally says he's on a mission from God.
And I remember the day like it was yesterday when God said, January 1st, 2022, you're going to be the mayor. I said, what? And you may not have noticed, but the last few months, as Pastor laid out, I have been talking about the need of God being back in our lives. And it's because the same voice I heard 32 years ago spoke to me a few months ago and said, talk about God, Eric. Talk about God.
I mean, like, talk about like a delusional kind of statement he's repeatedly said, or like the way in which he'll constantly be describing New York as a different city. Like, New York is actually the Port-au-Prince of America, or it's the Anchor of it. Like,
everyone knows that New York City is the Athens of America. It's the Istanbul of America. It's the Kiev of America. It's the Seoul of America. We are the Tel Aviv of America. New York City is the Islamabad of America. The Zagreb of America. We are the Lima of America. New York City is Mexico City of America. This is the Dublin of America, New York City.
His relationship with signification is a little malignant and strange in its own way. But what's so striking about this is that, who knows what's going on in his interiority, is that he, for all his idiosyncrasies, really, as your paper underscores, is just sort of the public face of an institution that's much more, inhuman, right, and not personalizable, in which basic people who are unhoused, right, who disproportionately have mental illnesses, will be essentially circuit back and forth from, I don't know, like the street to Bellevue to back again, or from an ER to a holding facility and then back on the street. And as the case examples you give, these are essentially sort of like, for them, it's this binary experience of I'm here or I'm there, right? I mean, from the position of institutions, each of which gets some cut of public funding or some sort of, financial stake in this, it's, now there's someone else's problem, right? Or here comes another frequent flyer is the term I've often heard used in these contexts, right? In and out of the system. And here's this revolving door. Yeah.
Hatred. Yeah. Hatred of them. Yes.
Actual contempt, right? And I think this is this is something that we were talking about. Oh my gosh, who was
with Brian Go-Smith?
With Brian Go-Smith about like the disavowed, or rather the repressed hatred or like distaste that social workers may develop towards their patients. And the problem isn't or their clients rather. And the thing isn't to like lean into the hatred and become cruel, but rather realize how if you don't acknowledge that, what actually does get experienced on their end, and which materially is the case, is a type of cruelty. And in some respects, it's so obvious, right, that the answer to that would be actually no. Instead of having someone be either, in Bellevue or in a gutter, how about they have multiple places to go? Instead of like depending on a institutional like apparatus that is simultaneously all about like panoptic surveillance, but that also just loses people in the shuffle, and where like, yes, you're a subject of control, but sometimes you're the problem of people in Rikers, and other times like there's literally no communication between these people. You can actually have you can build, I don't want to use the word maybe you have communities or social links, or in any event, other types of spaces where relationality becomes possible, and that isn't this sort of binary logic of zero sum, right? You're either on the street or you're not. But also too, and I think this is the point I wanted to really drive home here, is that, and talk about like madness in its full sense, the default, which I think we can never forget for how our status quo deals with people, or takes upon itself the task and perceives the task of having to quote unquote deal with people in psychotic spaces and individually, is more often than not, or at least disproportionately, just killing them, right? And I mean, the data on this sort of, you can look at the data on what amount of police calls relate to mental illness stuff is a little more sketchy, but when we get to actual police killings, right? I mean, the most recent data I was seeing out of Hopkins from the past year, I think covering the past 7 years of data, is that something between 60 and 70% of people who are killed by police officers are either in an acute psychotic episode, or they have an undiagnosed extensive long-term history of schizophrenia or something similar. And of course, that compounds by other types of vulnerability, race chief among them. But what that sort of comes down to, and it's a scene that I think is haunting and almost hard to think about, and people like the disability scholar Ray Tirana has written about very much, is this idea that like on some level, the social, like talk about the order of the law, right, and its full obscenity, but a person who is in a moment of delusion or hearing voices or and with all the anxiety and aggression that may be related to that, right, will suddenly be confronted by a group of people waving flashlights and screaming at them. And then if they don't drop prone immediately, if they don't understand that that's what's happening, those people have the legal right, immunized by the courts, to act in quote unquote fear of their life and kill that person. And they very regularly do. And in fact, recently, just a video on my timeline of a cop basically executing a woman, right? Whose crime was to invoke
Yes.
Jesus and throw some water around. And then after being like, well, she wasn't much of a loss anyways, or some other line that's even more horrible, right? And so it's
Yeah.
like, on a very practical level, both in a situation where, like, you know, the carceral state is all the neoliberal state really offers beyond that and profit margin, we have a situation in which the people are encounters are happening, or rather like collisions are happening, but what are not happening are sustained encounters.
And so what I want to make sure we get to talk about is that there is a programmatic dimension to, you know, there's a proposal that is a key part of this piece. It's not only analysis, but can you tell us a little bit about I don't even want to say just vision. I mean, I want to ask you about the vision, but also some of like the real, like the nitty gritty of what you are up to.
Sure. So a small group of us, of colleagues, have been developing a very small clinical program to work with younger people experiencing psychosis. And we have done it in a way where we each take on different roles depending on the specific case. So somebody comes to us, and typically the first thing we might do, although this can take a lot of time in some cases, and there's an entirely different relationship to time and temporality and patience, and, you know, to form the minimal rapport with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But without getting into all of that, when somebody's ready, they will immediately begin working with an analyst or a therapist who's working with us in their private office.
Mm-hmm.
And we consider this to be really the centrality of the work, meaning the real belief that the work is primarily an analytic or therapeutic work with this person in a privacy with a certain safety. And in addition to that, we work closely with Fountain House, which is a clubhouse here in New York City. It's been around for a very long time. And some of our clients will choose to become members at Fountain House, where they can engage in many different community projects with other people with various forms of serious mental illness. It's a really fantastic place. It's not without its problems, but it's a really fantastic place. And our prescriber is at Fountain House, and so can oftentimes welcome them there and kind of help them find a place there. We also do what we call network meetings, and this sort of is borrowed from two sources. In the tradition of institutional psychotherapy, it was important that they hold what they called constellation meetings. And this would be with the patient, but the patient maybe wouldn't be there. Any caregiver, so provider, family member, friends, another patient, would have these ongoing meetings where they discuss openly their encounters with that patient. So to your point earlier about, the importance of the encounter, but the encounter that goes unthought and treatment as usual, it's to counter this, right? And it's also to try to bring together the different transference effects of the patient among different people. And so we will hold ongoing network meetings and constellation meetings. And we give anybody in the network that the patient identifies the right to call a meeting at any given time. And we'll try to accommodate that quickly. This oftentimes has the effect of working through many psychical dynamics within families, between caretakers, between providers, even disagreements between the psychiatrists and the analysts, for example. This oftentimes has these effects on the patient themselves, right? To be able to sort of open something up, introduce circulation, introduce something that is more supple within the patient's network often has huge effects on the patient's ability to speak, to engage in their analysis, and so forth. And then we have a role that we call the liaison, that our colleague Isaiah has taken on, and he's kind of in the role of being with, accompanying the person in their specific creative projects if they're there. Sometimes he helps patients do what are called TMATs, it's a tool that comes from the peer community, which helps people plan for a crisis, right? So it helps somebody when they're in the right state of mind to think, if I have another crisis or if I have another manic episode, who do I want to be involved? Where do I want to go? What medications do I want or don't want? What are my kind of own ethics about how I want to kind of be cared for, and so forth. And it really helps people and their networks, the people that are supporting them, have this kind of foundation of continuity between very different states of mind that somebody might be in. So this is kind of the architecture of the program, and we can only accommodate a very small kind of number of people right now, and we're in no way do we think this is sort of addressing the larger kind of structural problems. We're not in the business of policy making, but we've been able now to connect to so many other colleagues who in their own settings are doing their own kind of work, that's creative, that exists sort of both inside and outside of the current institutional climate of care. And we're kind of hoping to just continue to develop a network of people who are trying to reinvent care in different ways. With the sort of understanding that you kind of have to, given that we're not in a place to really be able to shift these problems of the circuit, we're trying to just find ways to work around it when we can, or sometimes with it. I'm not against the hospital. I'm not anti-hospital. There's a time and a place for somebody to go to a hospital. But if they do, they can hold in mind that there's a place to come back to, right? They're not just going to be discharged to some random, community clinic or something like that, which is so often the case. And there have been cases where we can kind of divert hospitalization because we've kind of established enough of a holding environment between the patient and their other caregivers where they can manage a crisis, and another kind of ethic of how we like to work is that we like to see crises not as something that you avoid at all costs, that these are kind of necessary moments where something gets dislodged or some kind of question is arising for the person and their entourage or their family or within their network. And that these are moments where we can intervene in ways that obviously kind of protect the well-being of the patient and people around them, but more importantly, to really listen to the crisis and to stay with it, and not to just kind of medicate it away or send someone to the hospital, without really trying to see if we can open up something else in those moments. And what typically happens to break a certain repetition, a certain habit of care that comes from a place of fear, typically, in these situations.
You're doing, just incredible and inspiring and creative work. And Loren, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we go, for those of our listeners who might want to learn more from you about psychoanalytic theory, are you teaching any classes coming up?
Good question. haven't responded to those emails.
Yeah, I'm bad about that too. Yeah.
Sorry, Mark.
Sorry, Mark. I'm finishing a Lacan class at the moment. I'm going to be preoccupied with family matters probably for a little while. So I'm hopefully going to teach next year. And lately, I've typically been teaching classes on Freud and Lacan, and sometimes I'll throw in something else here and there. But I'll be around. Certainly, people are welcome to email me and be in touch.
Is Fountain House a thing people could learn more about? Like, if they wanted to learn more about the progress of the program, et cetera, like, because I'm sure people are like, oh, this is fascinating. How do I learn more?
I'd encourage people to go to the Fountain House website. But even more than that, anybody can take a tour, and it's a member-led tour. You can contact them. It's easy to contact and set one up. I would really encourage anybody to take a tour there. It's a very special place, and the experience of being there is a very, at least from an outside perspective, getting that experience, it's a very hopeful experience. And so Fountain House has many different projects going on in terms of offering members, care and opportunities, throughout the city. And it's a really important place to support. So I would just encourage people to take a tour and check out the website. Something else that will be, hitting the ground running pretty soon is the foundation that I'm involved in, the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis. We the foundation gave a grant to our colleague to help us in this work with Fountain House. And we're going to be doing a series of events at the foundation space in Brooklyn in the coming year, film showings, talks. We're going to have an inaugural conference in September on community psychoanalysis. Brian is actually going to be doing the keynote.
Oh, awesome.
Wonderful.
Which he agreed to yesterday. So there's going to be, much going on, I think, in the coming couple of years here in New York City, at least in terms of, analysts kind of speaking to some of these issues and trying to rethink how we can do our work. So, yeah, I think those would be two good places to start, and people can email me and Matthew, and we'd love to hear from people.
Wonderful. Well, I will put all of that in the show notes for listeners. And Loren, thank you so much. This has just been such an incredible conversation. I have so much to think about, but it was really a pleasure.
Thank you too.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Loren Dent. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.